Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This week we are going to be diving into culture. Now, as I talked about in our previous lecture, there isn't one clear-cut definition of culture that every anthropologist uses. This happens to be my favorite. This is another definition I like, although it is hella long, so I'm going to let you pause for a second and just read it on your own. And you'll notice that some words are in bold. That's going to become important later, I promise. So let's use this generic definition of culture that comes from your textbook and work with that. And I want to start working with one particular aspect of it, the learned values, beliefs, and knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about cultural knowledge. So cultural knowledge is all of the information that somebody learns by being a part of a culture or a society. That knowledge is necessary in order for the group to survive, in order for them to adapt to the environment, in order for them to live peacefully, etc., etc. Now, in her text, Bonvillain gives us a couple of examples that we can look to, and one of them is the Sami. So let's talk a little bit about what the cultural knowledge for the Sami people of Norway looks like. The Sami are the indigenous people of northern Norway who live in small communities and raise reindeer, live off the land, etc. So they need a very specific set of cultural knowledge. They need to know how to live in a snowy environment and how to survive. So this means building shelter, how to raise reindeer, how to hunt, how to skin animals and then use those skins and furs for clothing, how to produce water and enough heat in order to survive, even when weather conditions get really bad, things like that. In addition, because the Sami live in a really seasonal environment, like it's really fucking cold in the winter, but in the summer they actually get some pretty decent weather, they need to know how to live seasonally. That means gathering food seasonally, handling their wildlife like the reindeer that they raise, dealing with all of their seasonal needs, etc., etc. In addition, they also have to deal with the state of Norway. So this is an indigenous group. They obviously have to fight for indigenous rights. And that includes negotiating with the modern state of Norway, where they reside. So this includes not just cultural knowledge of past traditions and interface with the environment, but also cultural knowledge of how to navigate the current political landscape of the country that they live in. Another example we could look at are the Tuareg. The Tuareg are the indigenous people of the Sahara in the northern part of Africa. These people have been living in the Saharan desert for millennia. They know how to traverse it with camels, how to raise camels for food, how to get food out of the desert, how to navigate in some pretty dusty, sandy, nondescript areas, and how to do some very modern things like avoid landmines, as well as negotiate with the governments of the multiple countries that control the territory that they live in. Of course, we also have cultural knowledge that we need in order to live here in New Jersey. I want you to take a few moments and actually think about what kind of cultural knowledge you need in order to survive as a TCNJ student, be successful as an American and a citizen of New Jersey. This is the kind of question that, I don't know, might appear on an exam. So I definitely would take some time and think about it, eh? So now that we've defined culture, and now that we understand cultural knowledge a little bit better, let's actually talk about some of the characteristics of culture and why these are important, both in the study of anthropology and also just in our understanding of the human experience generally. Culture is shared, learned, adaptive, integrated, symbolic, and worldview making. Let me break each of these apart and discuss them in a little more detail so that it's very clear. First of all, culture is shared. You can't just be one person with your own culture. That's not a culture, that's you thinking you're special. But when we share culture, while we share some ideal types, we don't share all views or all opinions. That's why there's diversity. So typically, cultures have a hegemonic view. The hegemony is the overarching dominant cultural presence. On the other hand, you also have subcultures or smaller groups within society that have their own identity and their own way of life, and they differ from the hegemonic view. Now, the hegemonic view is not necessarily better. It's not necessarily right or fair or equal or just or good. It's just dominant. In many cases, positive cultural change can come when subcultures grow and eventually move to the forefront of popular discourse and popular imagination. Now, if culture is shared, that means it has to be passed from person to person, and they have to share in those understandings of that culture. Therefore, culture is also learned, and we learn culture through a process properly titled enculturation. So you learn everything from social norms and cultural point of views, from school, from your family, from television and media, from your friends, etc., etc. Now, we'll talk later about cultural change, but part of the reason cultural change happens is that culture is adaptive. People and societies adapt to changes in their physical environment, social changes. Man, we are finding this out right now, right? Because we are in the middle of a pandemic, and every country around the world, their culture has to adapt in some way to deal with the fact that we're all social isolating, etc., etc. Now, cultures around the world have adapted over time and over history, and this can be for a variety of reasons. But more recently, in the last 150 years, colonialism and globalization have really led to a massive amount of cultural adaptation around the globe. Now, a lot of cultural adaptations are great. For example, a lot of societies have adapted to integrate in new technologies, and these technologies have led to the democratization of media, new medical advances, gender equality, etc. However, not all adaptations that cultures make are great. Some of them can be actually really bad, both for the individuals that live in those societies, as well as for society as a whole or even the planet as a whole. Think about the number of ways that our culture has adapted to embrace new technologies and new products, but at the expense of the planet and the environment. So not all cultural adaptations are good. It's not automatic that an adaptation is progress is positive, and that's a good thing. That's not always the case. Some cultural adaptations are great, other ones, not so much. Another important characteristic of culture is that it's integrated. This goes back to that whole complex whole definition of culture. But culture is part of our everyday life. It's integrated into all of our activities. We don't even notice. Like, you don't wake up and go, I'm gonna do some culture today. No, you wake up and you go, well, I'm gonna brush my hair like this, and I'm gonna style it like this, and I'm gonna put on this particular set of clothes for fashion for this, and then I'm gonna go outside, and then you realize you can't go outside because it's the pandemic, and then you run back inside, and then you turn on Netflix, and then you try to chill. That's all just integrated right into your everyday life. You didn't stop and go, I'm thinking about art, I'm thinking about nature, I'm thinking about culture. No, you just like Netflixed and chilled. That's what I mean when I say culture is integrated. Now, we also know that culture is based on symbols. A symbol is just something that represents something else. It's an image or an idea, but it represents another image, another idea, a physical thing, a situation, a historical context, etc. So a symbol is something really simple, and it represents something far more complicated. Now, some symbols are completely arbitrary. What that means is there's nothing that actually connects the symbol directly to the thing that it represents. And I'll give you an example. If you see a red 8-sided sign with a white outline, you stop. How do you know to stop? Because that's the symbol for stopping. Why? Like, what is it about a red octagon that's like, oh, you gotta stop now? Nothing. We've just been taught that that symbol means you gotta stop now. And so it's completely arbitrary. Why red? Why not blue? Why not purple? Why an octagon? Why not a star? Why not a middle finger? It literally could be anything. But we understand this arbitrary symbol. And so no matter where I go in the world, if I see red octagon, white outline, boom, I stop my car. But other symbols are motivated. In other words, there's a direct connection between the symbol and what it represents. And when we see that, we understand that connection. It pulls on our heartstrings. It connects to some understanding, some deeper thing. And we go, yep, I see that. I remember that. They go together. And now I understand what I'm feeling. So a great example of this is the cross, right? Now, this symbol doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. To people who are Hindu and live in India, they might look at a cross and be like, ooh, look, 2 sticks crossing each other. Okay. But to a Christian, this is a motivated symbol because they see the cross and they think forgiveness. Now, it's not that the cross literally gives them forgiveness. It's that they go to the cross. That's what Jesus was crucified on. That crucifixion was so that we could be forgiven for our sins. Therefore, when I see a cross, it makes me think of forgiveness. Unless, of course, you're an African American who's had a cross burned in your lawn. Then the symbol takes on a different meaning. And that's one of the interesting things about symbols. They don't always mean the same thing to all people. We have an entire subfield of anthropology that just focuses on symbols, and that's semiotics, or symbolic analysis. I'm a big fan of semiotics. I'm a big fan of symbolic analysis because I do anthropology of religion, and there are tons of religious symbols that are used around the world. So I'm really interested in the ways that symbols mean different things to different groups. On the screen right now is an example of a symbol that is used by two different groups in two completely different ways that I find really, really interesting, and that's the swastika. The swastika is a symbol that has been used in Buddhism for thousands of years, and it represents movement, flow, progression on the wheel of samsara, progression towards nirvana, and ultimately, if it's pointing the correct direction, success. Turn it the other direction, painted a certain set of colors, and you have the symbol that Hitler used in his Nazi propaganda. Definitely not the same meaning as the Buddhist swastika. And as a matter of fact, the swastika that the Nazis chose is the backward swastika, which is supposed to, in Buddhism, represent regression, going backwards, failure. So a lot of Buddhists were like, well, it does make sense that he chose that swastika. It is the swastika of, regression. But that's a whole other point. My point is that when I, as an American, went to Korea or Myanmar or other Buddhist countries, and I looked at the swastika, I couldn't help but thinking of the other version of the symbol that I had in my mind, which is, in many ways, it represents the exact opposite values of the Buddhist swastika. So it's just interesting to sort of think about the way that one symbol can have different meanings, like totally and completely different meanings, to different groups. That's the power of symbols, but it also demonstrates the difficulty of symbolic analysis. But part of why I love studying symbols is that symbols are moments of shared understanding, and that works across time and space. So when I'm walking around in a cathedral that was built in the 1500s down in South America, I'm looking at the symbols of Christianity, and they're the same symbols that Christians looked at 500 years ago. So in a way, I can emotionally, mentally, cosmologically, whatever, connect to them because we have a shared understanding of those symbols that we're experiencing, even if we're experiencing them 500 years apart. And finally, culture is worldview making. Now, we already talked about worldviews in one of the earlier lectures. Worldviews are those underlying understandings that shape our comprehension of the universe. They give us our creation myths, they give us the understanding of what happens when we die, how does science work, etc. So worldviews are our understanding of what it is to exist in the world. And culture makes these through naturalized concepts. These are the ideas that are so deeply ingrained in a culture that we think of them as natural. We think of them as a priori. We think of them as non-negotiables. So, for example, in the United States, ideas of freedom and your rights are some of the naturalized concepts that we are really, really focused on. There are times, however, when these naturalized concepts are called into question by a society or a culture. And when that happens, we start seeing a cultural shift or possibly even culture wars. A culture war happens when there are major disagreements within society about what the values and principles of the society should be. In other words, part of a society or culture disagrees about what it should mean to be a member of that society. Cultural models get called into question. Even the hegemonic views of a society are questioned in terms of their values and their morality. Cultural wars tend to happen when you have countercultural movements, which are when entire segments of society basically argue, look, there's an alternative to the way that our society has always done things, and this alternative cultural model is better. When a countercultural movement gets enough popular support, that's when we begin to see cultural change. That's when a culture war turns into an actual cultural shift. Your next question is probably, Chloe, are we in the middle of a culture war right now? Yeah. America is absolutely in the middle of a culture war right now. And I'm just trying to keep it real with you guys. Like, it may not be pleasant to say, look, we're in the middle of a culture war, but we are. And I don't know the solution to it. But it's going to take a while. It's going to be messy. We're going to get through it. We're going to be something else on the other side. Maybe better, maybe worse. We'll find out. I don't know. We can talk about this in discussion session. Anyway, this has gone on for a bit, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for listening.